War and Revolution, section, Total Mobilization, Totalism, and Totalitarianism. By way of example, let us turn to a liberal country like Italy. It has rightly been observed that the situation following intervention in the war seemed to anticipate the univers concentraire experienced by the world in subsequent decades. End quote. Compulsory conscription, military tribunals, execution squads, emergency legislation or state of siege constricting not only the army, but the civilian population itself in an iron grip. At the front, in order not to die, so as not to be forced to die, soldiers not infrequently committed self-mutilation, sometimes with horrific consequences. But military justice was blind. Its spies were everywhere, and not a few of those who had mutilated themselves were condemned to death. So as not to waste time, one general, Andrea Graziani, always carried out trench inspections with execution squads in tow. There were instances of decimation, which, reported the High Command, commanders had an absolute, inescapable duty to resort to, where necessary. Even when seriously wounded, soldiers enjoyed no respite. Gaetano Salvemini pointed out to the government that it was inadvisable to let them spend their convalescence with their family, because their talk about the tragic reality of the war would have extremely dangerous psychological effects. As far as possible, soldiers' relatives must be kept in the dark about the horrors of the front, but were nevertheless jointly responsible for the behavior of their kin. Quote, for psychological purposes, the High Command requested punitive measures against the kin of deserters, even if they were uninvolved in the crime of their relative. End quote. With practices of decimation and transversal punishments or vendettas, we are far beyond terror of the Jacobin variety, which precisely did not abrogate individual responsibility, even if it ascertained it on the basis of mere inklings or suspicions. Here, by contrast, the totalitarian universe clearly emerges. Decimation was used to end numerous human lives at random, on the basis not even of vague suspicion, but solely for pedagogical purposes of restoring rigid discipline among slave soldiers destined for sacrifice and death. Added to this was a paranoid hunt for foreign agents, requiring the dismissal from their jobs of citizens of Austro-German origin or with Austro-German parents, as well as a ubiquitous, rigid network of control. Encompassing the whole population, it even stipulated the character and length of obituaries, and spied on private life, correspondence, and conversations, so as to prevent and punish any diffusion of rumors or news, quote, whereby public peace might be disturbed in any way or the public interest damaged. End quote. Jurisdiction was devolved onto military tribunals, which were manipulated by the High Command in every aspect and phase of their activity. They seemed to demand not only obedience, but also enthusiasm. In fact, what they wanted was that certain expressions should not even be thought. The state, Weber observed in 1917, is accorded legitimate power over life, death, and liberty. This also applies to countries with the oldest liberal traditions. In the USA, a Committee on Public Information was created that would appear to afford the first example of effective total mobilization of the means of information. Emergency legislation allowed for maximum prison terms of 20 years for anyone using, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military or naval forces of the United States, or the flag, or the uniform of the Army or Navy of the United States. End quote. The logic of such developments was made clear by the U.S. Justice Department, which, in demanding the rapid enactment of laws against sedition, they were approved by the House of Representatives in under 4 hours, observed, quote, Our soldiers temporarily surrender their liberties of thought and speech and action in order that they may save them for the future. The whole nation must subject itself to discipline until after the war. Otherwise, in defending liberties in detail, we may lose liberty altogether." End quote. Military discipline tended to be extended from the front to the rear, in accordance with the inexorable logic of total mobilization, total war, and total politics. This is where we must start to explain the genesis of the term and reality of totalismo, as it was initially called, or totalitarianism proper. And an integral part of this totalism or totalitarianism was the combination of terror from above with terror from below. In the USA, anti-sedition laws were also justified by the need to prevent resort to lynching by exasperated patriots, ready to take the law into their own hands. In reality, vigilante squads were openly encouraged by the authorities, with the result that a hang-them-all at sunrise attitude spread towards those suspected of treason or lack of patriotic zeal. For a rounded picture, we must take a rapid look at what occurred in the colonies. In Egypt, peasants caught in the bazaars were arrested and sent to the nearest mobilization centers. Those who fled did not get far. For the most part, they were captured in outlying villages and sent to barracks under escort. In the words of a British historian, quote, "Some 50 million Africans and 250 million Indians were involved by Britain, without consultation, in a war of which they understood nothing." End quote. The more or less forced labor extracted by the metropolis in the colonies needs to be added to the cannon fodder. In different ways and to varying degrees of intensity, the totalitarian logic of total war manifested itself in all of the countries involved in the conflict. In the USA, Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed that there was no room for divided loyalties. Anyone claiming to have them, quote, "is necessarily a traitor to at least one country." People therefore had to be on their guard, quote, "The Hun within our gates masquerades in many disguises. He is our dangerous enemy, and he should be hunted down without mercy." End quote. Given that the death sentence intimated here was bound up with a concrete form of behavior, there was still a way out, which tended to narrow or disappear completely as and when the enemy was subject to a process of racialization. Suspected of forming a fifth column, German aliens, required by Wilson to register officially, became the target of a campaign of terror. Their property and businesses were seized at the behest of the Justice Secretary. Sometimes, along with other potential traitors, they were marked out with a yellow symbol. As we know, there were also those who invoked the sterilization of a genetically tainted race. Measures of expropriation against the national minority, suspected of insufficient patriotic loyalty, and whom it was, therefore, a good idea to neutralize and punish economically. The yellow symbol, and the emergence, finally, of the idea of the forced sterilization and mercy killing of entire ethnic groups. These put us in mind of the Third Reich. Historical revisionism ignores such glaring facts, claiming to deduce a priori the univers concentraire from the revolutionary project. Yet it was precisely that political tradition which denounced the totalitarian effects of war in advance, seeking in vain at two crucial points in contemporary history to avert them. War, observed Robespierre between the end of 1791 and the beginning of 1792, concentrated all the forces of the state in the hands of the executive power, whose popularity and dominance grew. Executive power was, or felt itself, entitled, quote, to take decisions on its own, sweeping aside any resistance by diffusing a spirit of blind, absolute obedience, or, if needs be, by resorting to martial law and placing under military command our border cities. In conclusion, beginning of long quote. War is always the primary aspiration of a powerful government that wants to become even more powerful. It is during war that executive power deploys the most formidable energy and exercises a kind of dictatorship, which cannot but threaten nascent liberty. It is during war that the people forget deliberations of fundamental importance to their civil and political rights, and concern themselves exclusively with external events. End of long quote. War was therefore, quote, the greatest scourge threatening liberty in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, end quote, and risked placing the fate of the state in the hands of an army, a general. In effect, having led to the institution of the terror, the interminable conflict with the anti-French coalition resulted in 1799 in a coup d'etat by a warlord who exploited the glory he had won on the battlefield to establish a new kind of despotism. Paradoxically, Robespierre analyzed and denounced in advance not only Bonapartism, but the very Jacobin dictatorship of which he became a protagonist. Something similar occurred in the relationship between the Marxist and Bolshevik movement on the one hand, and 20th century totalitarianism on the other. Towards the end of the 19th century, Engels warned against the inevitably disastrous effects of the impending European conflagration. Already, increasing militarization and, quote, rivalry and conquest have tuned up the public power to such a pitch that it threatens to swallow the whole of society and even the state, end quote. Once war had broken out, Lenin referred to this analysis, but it was developed by Bukharin in particular. The latter saw looming on the horizon a new Leviathan compared with which Thomas Hobbes's fantasy seemed like child's play. It was not limited to controlling production and manpower, reduced to more or less servile conditions. The qualitative leap involved went far beyond the political and economic spheres. Quote, philosophy, medicine, religion and ethics, chemistry and bacteriology. Everything has been mobilized and militarized, just like industry and finance. End quote. This is unquestionably an early analysis of totalitarianism, even if the word had yet to feature. In addition, Bukharin lucidly grasped the phenomenon subsequently termed the nationalization of the masses, meticulously listing the countless associations diffused in society, e.g. in France, that organized and regimented it in unanimous support of colonial expansion and military policy. It can be said that this super Leviathan also ended up materializing in the state of which Bukharin was a leader and, subsequently, a victim. At all events, it remains the case that the first critical analysis of the totalitarian phenomenon was developed on the basis of an ideology from which historical revisionism claims to deduce it. That is not all. In the late 18th century, the Jacobin press drew attention to the dynamic whereby war created the horrors of fanaticism and familiarized soldiers and citizens with blood, butchery, and the daily spectacle of combat, thus creating contempt for the tranquil, pacific liberty which is our happiness. This is a diagnosis readily applicable to the delight in bellicose adventures and blood that found expression in the 20th century, in authors like Theodore Roosevelt and Ernst Jünger. Likewise, during the First World War, it was the Marxist tradition that first highlighted its genocidal tendencies. While Bukharin referred to a nightmarish corpse factory, Luxemburg went even further. On the battlefields, mass murder and genocide, Völkermord, were becoming such daily, tediously monotonous realities that a climate of ritual murder was prevalent in the rear. This denunciation was contemporaneous with the tragedy of the Armenians. On account of the First World War, a gigantic, interminable sacrificial rite, ritual homicide, tended to be transformed from myth into reality. In the two key moments of contemporary history referred to above, it was the political and social classes targeted by the revolutionary movement that celebrated the marvelous impact of war in regenerating and reconstructing national unity. We have already mentioned the myth of the Splendid Little War, which was widespread on the eve of the First World War. It should be remembered that the creation of political and social harmony and the containment and rollback of the revolutionary movement were objectives likewise pursued by supporters of bellicose adventures in France. Invoked as an antidote to revolution, the international conflict gave them powerful impetus, and this ended up burdening the revolutionary movement itself with the disastrous effects it had denounced in the war. A similar dialectic is manifest in 1792 and 1917. End section.